9:17 in the morning, January 22nd, 1943. A young officer crouched inside the ruins of a destroyed Japanese bunker, his eye pressed against a civilian hunting scope, watching a banyan tree 240 yards away. His name was John George, 2nd Lieutenant, 132nd Infantry Regiment, 27 years old, Illinois State Champion marksman. 0 confirmed kills in combat. Around his position the jungle hummed with insects, and somewhere in those trees ahead, Japanese snipers waited with infinite patience, rifles trained on anything that moved. In the previous 72 hours, those snipers had eliminated 14 American soldiers. The rifle in George's hands was not Army issue. It was a Winchester Model 70, a bolt-action hunting rifle he had purchased with 2 years of National Guard pay back in Illinois. Mounted on top sat a Lyman Alaskan scope, a piece of equipment designed for hunting deer in the American Midwest, not for hunting men in the jungles of the Solomon Islands. Every officer in his battalion had mocked that rifle. Captain Morris had ordered him to leave what he called the mail-order sweetheart in his tent and carry a real weapon. His fellow platoon leaders said a sporting rifle had no place in modern warfare. They were all wrong. What happened over the next 4 days in the Point Cruz groves would change how American commanders viewed individual marksmanship in the Pacific Theater. And the techniques John George developed would save lives in ways no one anticipated. If you are watching this, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Now let us return to those jungles and understand how one man with a rifle his superiors despised became the answer to an invisible threat. The story of John George begins not in the Pacific but in the American heartland, in Chicago, Illinois, where a young man discovered he had an unusual gift. George prepared at Lakeview High School in Chicago, and from an early age he demonstrated exceptional ability with firearms. By 1939, at just 19 years old, he was shooting with the Illinois Rifle Team, a child prodigy in a discipline that demanded steady nerves, perfect breath control, and the patience of a surgeon. In 1940, George enlisted as a private in the Illinois National Guard. He could have waited, could have continued his education, could have pursued any number of paths that did not lead to jungle warfare on the other side of the world. But like millions of young Americans in that era, he felt the pull of duty, the sense that something larger was coming, something that would require men willing to serve. When he enlisted, George brought something unusual with him. He had saved his National Guard pay, every dollar he could spare, and used it to purchase a Winchester Model 70 rifle chambered in .30-06. This was not standard military equipment. This was a civilian hunting rifle, one of the finest bolt-action rifles ever manufactured in America. The Winchester Model 70 had earned the nickname the Rifleman's Rifle because of its exceptional accuracy, its smooth action, and its reliability in the field. George added a Lyman Alaskan scope, a 4-power optic designed for hunting in the wilderness. Together, the rifle and scope represented a significant investment. But George understood something his Army instructors did not fully appreciate. He understood that accuracy at distance was not simply about firepower. It was about precision, about placing one shot exactly where it needed to go, about making the first round count because in combat you might not get a second chance. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, George was assigned to the 132nd Infantry Regiment, part of the 23rd Infantry Division, better known as the Americal Division. The Americal was unique in American military history. Its name was a combination of America and New Caledonia, the location where the division was activated in May 1942. It was the only United States Army division in World War II to be formed outside the continental United States, and the only division to receive its name from its location, rather than a numerical designation. George went through infantry officer training, emerged as a 2nd lieutenant, and found himself bound for the South Pacific. Throughout his training, he carried his Winchester Model 70. He practiced with it constantly, maintaining his skills, zeroing the scope, learning exactly how the rifle performed at various distances and in various conditions. His instructors noticed his marksmanship ability, but they also noticed his attachment to what they considered an inappropriate weapon for modern infantry warfare. The Army in 1942 was in love with semi-automatic firepower. The standard American infantry rifle was the M1 Garand, a revolutionary semi-automatic rifle that could fire 8 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. The Garand gave American infantry a significant advantage over enemies still equipped with bolt-action rifles. It was reliable, powerful, and fast. Army doctrine emphasized volume of fire, the ability to suppress an enemy position with continuous rounds, while maneuvering for an assault. In this context, George's bolt-action Winchester seemed hopelessly outdated. It fired slower than the Garand, held fewer rounds, and required the shooter to manually work the bolt between each shot. Why would any sensible soldier carry a hunting rifle into modern combat? George had an answer, but it was not one his superiors wanted to hear. The Winchester Model 70 was more accurate than the Garand at extended ranges. The bolt-action mechanism was inherently more precise because the barrel did not need to accommodate the gas system required for semi-automatic operation. The rifle grouped tighter at 300 yards, and with the Lyman Alaskan scope, George could identify and engage targets that Garand-equipped soldiers could barely see. But in the training camps of 1942, nobody was listening to a junior officer who thought he knew better than the Army's weapons experts. George kept his rifle, ignored the mockery, and waited for combat to prove his point. On December 8, 1942, the 132nd Infantry Regiment arrived on Guadalcanal. The island had been a battleground since August, when the 1st Marine Division landed to capture a partially completed Japanese airfield. The Marines had held the perimeter around what became Henderson Field through months of brutal combat, surviving Japanese naval bombardments, aerial attacks, and ground assaults that pushed them to the breaking point. By December, the Marines were exhausted. The Army was arriving to relieve them and to finish the job of clearing the remaining Japanese forces from the island. The 132nd was part of this relief force, joining the American Division in what would become the final offensive operations of the Guadalcanal campaign. George and his fellow soldiers stepped off their transport ship into a world unlike anything they had experienced in training. The heat was oppressive, a wet, suffocating blanket that never lifted. The humidity made clothing rot, metal rust, and wounds fester. Insects swarmed in clouds so thick soldiers breathed them in. Malaria stalked the American perimeter as surely as any Japanese soldier, and dysentery weakened men who needed every ounce of strength to survive. The jungle itself was an enemy. Visibility dropped to a few yards in the dense vegetation. Movement was exhausting, every step requiring effort through tangled vines and across fallen trees. Sound traveled strangely, making it difficult to locate threats. And everywhere, unseen in the green darkness, Japanese soldiers waited. The Japanese defenders of Guadalcanal had learned hard lessons in the months of fighting. Their early tactics, the mass banzai charges that had swept through weaker opponents in Malaya and the Philippines, had failed catastrophically against American firepower. At the Tenarú River and on Edson's Ridge, Marine machine guns and artillery had annihilated waves of charging Japanese infantry. The survivors adapted. Japanese snipers became one of the most feared elements of the Guadalcanal battlefield. These men climbed into the massive banyan trees that dominated the jungle, concealing themselves in the canopy 30 or 40 feet above the ground. They tied themselves to branches so they would not fall if wounded. They carried limited ammunition and water, planning to stay in position for days if necessary, and they waited with extraordinary patience for targets of opportunity. The preferred targets were officers, radio operators, and anyone who appeared to be directing American operations. Japanese snipers had learned to identify American leaders by their behavior, by the maps they carried, by the way other soldiers deferred to them. A single sniper, in a well-chosen position, could paralyze an entire company, forcing soldiers to cower behind cover while their leaders were systematically eliminated. The 132nd Infantry's initial assignment was defending Lunga Point, the main American supply area around Henderson Field. This was relatively safe duty, giving the newly arrived soldiers time to acclimatize to the conditions. But events elsewhere on the island would soon draw them into offensive operations. In December 1942 and January 1943, American forces were engaged in fierce fighting around Mount Austin, a jungle-covered height that dominated the approaches to Henderson Field. Japanese forces had fortified positions on and around the mountain, creating a defensive complex the Americans called the Gifu. The fighting was brutal, with American infantry struggling to reduce Japanese bunkers in terrain that favored the defenders. The 132nd Infantry was committed to this fighting. The regiment's 1st and 3rd Battalions attacked the Gifu directly, while the 2nd Battalion, George's Battalion, undertook a flanking maneuver around the Japanese positions. This maneuver covered nearly 2 miles through dense jungle, guided by native Solomon Islander scouts who knew the trails. George experienced his first combat during these operations, and he began to understand the reality of jungle warfare in ways that training had never prepared him for. The fighting was close, often at ranges of 50 yards or less. Visibility was measured in feet, not yards, and the threat of snipers was constant, a psychological weight that pressed down on every soldier who moved through the green darkness. During the Mount Austin fighting, George began using his Winchester Model 70 for its intended purpose. When his unit encountered Japanese positions, when targets presented themselves at distances beyond effective Garand range, George engaged them with his scoped rifle. He recorded his first confirmed kills during this period, proving to himself, if not yet to his superiors, that his unconventional weapon had value in combat. The 132nd Infantry lost 112 men killed in action on Guadalcanal, with 268 wounded and 3 missing. These numbers represented the cost of clearing Japanese forces from the island, a cost paid in blood by ordinary soldiers doing an extraordinary job. By mid-January 1943, the focus of American operations shifted westward, toward the coast and the remaining Japanese positions around Point Cruz and beyond. The Japanese were no longer capable of offensive operations, but they maintained defensive positions that had to be reduced before American forces could advance to the western end of the island. And in the jungle groves west of Point Cruz, Japanese snipers had created a killing ground that was bleeding American units white. 14 American soldiers had died in 72 hours in those groves. The snipers were ghosts, invisible predators who struck without warning and disappeared before any response could be organized. American patrols entered the area and took casualties without ever seeing the enemy. Counter-sniper efforts using standard infantry tactics had failed. The groves had become a no-go zone, an area where death waited in the treetops. Battalion command needed a solution. They needed someone who could enter those groves and eliminate the sniper threat. And that was when John George volunteered. On the morning of January 22, 1943, George moved into position in the ruins of a destroyed Japanese bunker on the edge of the Point Cruz groves. He was not entirely alone. He had arranged for a spotter with field binoculars to accompany him, someone who could help identify targets and watch for threats from directions George could not cover. But the killing would be his responsibility. George had studied the problem. He understood that Japanese snipers relied on concealment and patience. They chose positions with good fields of fire and waited for targets to present themselves. But this approach created vulnerabilities. A sniper who remained stationary could be located by careful observation. A sniper who fired revealed his position through muzzle flash, smoke, or the sound of his shot. And a sniper who believed himself invisible might not take adequate precautions against counter-sniper fire. George's plan was simple in concept but demanding in execution. He would enter the groves, move slowly and carefully, and use his superior optics to locate Japanese snipers before they located him. Then he would eliminate them one by one, using the accuracy of his Winchester Model 70 to make each shot count. He expected to fire few rounds. He expected each round to result in a kill. The first sniper revealed himself through movement. George was scanning the canopy of a banyan tree 240 yards from his position when he detected something that did not belong, a shape that broke the natural pattern of branches and leaves. He studied the shape through his scope, watching patiently, waiting for confirmation. And then the shape moved again, just slightly, adjusting position. George settled his crosshairs on the center of that shape, controlled his breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester barked once, the sound sharp and flat in the humid air. Through his scope, George watched the shape convulse and then tumble from the tree, crashing through branches before hitting the ground with a sound that carried across the jungle. First kill. One round fired. There was no time for reflection. George's shot would have alerted other snipers in the area. He needed to relocate, to change his position before anyone could calculate where the shot had come from. He moved through the undergrowth, slow and careful, finding a new vantage point that offered different sight lines into the grove. The hunting continued. Throughout January 22nd, George worked his way through the edge of the groves, stopping, scanning, locating targets, and engaging them with single shots. Some targets were obvious, men who had grown careless in their concealment. Others were subtle, requiring long minutes of observation before George could confirm they were human rather than shadows. By the end of that first day, George had fired 12 shots and confirmed 8 kills, 4 misses attributable to range, wind, and the difficulty of shooting through jungle vegetation. But 8 Japanese snipers who had been killing Americans were now dead. That night, George cleaned his rifle and considered the mathematics of what he was doing. Intelligence suggested approximately 11 Japanese snipers were operating in the Point Cruz groves. He had eliminated 8. 3 remained, but those 3 would now know that something had changed, that a hunter had entered their domain. They would be more cautious, more alert, more difficult to find. The second day was harder. The surviving snipers had adjusted their tactics, choosing positions that offered better concealment, moving more frequently, refusing to present easy targets. George spent hours observing without finding any opportunity to shoot. The jungle seemed empty of threats, but he knew better. The enemy was there, waiting for him to make a mistake. Patience won. By late afternoon, George had located and eliminated 2 more snipers, bringing his total to 10. 1 Japanese sniper remained somewhere in those groves, the most skilled or the most cautious of the original 11. Finding him would require something different. On the third day, George tried a new approach. Instead of hunting from the perimeter of the groves, he penetrated deeper into the jungle, moving toward areas where the last sniper might be hiding. This was dangerous work. He was exposing himself to potential ambush, entering terrain where a single misstep could be fatal. But George understood that the final sniper would not reveal himself to an observer watching from outside. He needed to draw the man out. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. George was moving along a water-filled crater when he detected movement ahead, not in the trees but at ground level. A Japanese soldier was moving through the undergrowth, heading in his direction, but not yet aware of his presence. George froze, watching through his scope, trying to determine if this was the sniper he had been hunting. The soldier was carrying a rifle with a telescopic sight. This was the man. George tracked him as he moved, waiting for a clear shot. The sniper was 38 yards away now, close enough that George could see details of his equipment and uniform. But the man was facing the wrong direction, moving toward a position that would have given him a view of the area where George had been operating the previous day. His back was exposed. George had a clear shot, center mass at 38 yards, an easy shot even without a scope. But he hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He had evaded everything the Americans had thrown at him. He was skilled and dangerous, and something about that demanded a moment of recognition. Then, George fired. The shot was perfect. The sniper fell where he stood. 11 shots fired over 3 days against Japanese snipers. 11 Japanese snipers killed. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had eliminated 14 Americans in 72 hours. If this story is gripping you, consider subscribing and liking this video to support content like this. Let us continue. But George's mission was not finished. As he climbed out of the crater and retrieved his spent cartridges, he heard a sound that made him freeze. Japanese voices coming from the tree line nearby. He had wandered closer to enemy-held territory than he realized, and now a group of Japanese infantry was approaching his position. What followed was not a sniper engagement, but a close-quarters firefight. George used his Winchester and his sidearm to defend himself as Japanese soldiers closed on his position. In the confused fighting, he eliminated 3 more enemy soldiers before breaking contact and withdrawing toward American lines. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry let him through. George walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris, the same officer who had once ordered him to leave his mail-order sweetheart in his tent. Morris wanted a full debrief. George provided it. 11 Japanese snipers eliminated over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers, 11 hits, plus a close-quarters firefight with infantry. 3 more kills, 17 rounds total. The Point Cruz groves were silent. The sniper threat that had paralyzed American operations in that sector had been eliminated by one officer with a hunting rifle his superiors had dismissed as a toy. The success at Point Cruz did not end George's war. In the days following his sniper hunting operation, he was tasked with organizing and training other soldiers in the techniques he had developed. Battalion commanders who had dismissed his Winchester Model 70 now wanted to know how he had achieved results that conventional counter-sniper tactics had failed to produce. George's approach was based on several principles that contradicted standard Army thinking. First, he emphasized patience over firepower. A single well-aimed shot was more effective than a dozen rounds fired at a suspected position. Second, he stressed the importance of optics. Being able to see the enemy before the enemy saw you was the key advantage that made counter-sniper work possible. Third, he taught movement discipline, the art of relocating after each shot to avoid becoming a target yourself. The sniper section George helped establish continued operations through early February 1943. The results were remarkable. In 12 days of operations, the section achieved 74 confirmed kills against 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. These numbers were conservative, counting only kills where the body could be observed and confirmed. The actual impact was certainly higher. Japanese soldiers who might have fought effectively from defensive positions were instead pinned down, afraid to move, afraid to expose themselves to the invisible rifles that reached out from American lines. The Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal accelerated during this period. Japanese destroyers arrived at night to pick up troops from Cape Esperance on the western tip of the island. American forces pushed west to interdict the evacuation, but the Japanese fought effective rearguard actions to protect their withdrawal. George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating Japanese soldiers covering the retreat routes. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tenambogo River when a Japanese rifleman shot him. The bullet struck George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around and knocked him down. His spotter dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but not fatal. George had survived, but his time on Guadalcanal was over. He was evacuated for medical treatment, while the final operations on the island continued without him. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The Japanese had completed their evacuation, pulling approximately 13,000 survivors off the island in a series of nighttime destroyer runs. The Guadalcanal campaign was over. The campaign had lasted 6 months and cost both sides heavily. American forces suffered approximately 7,000 casualties, including nearly 1,700 killed in action. Japanese losses were catastrophic, with approximately 30,000 soldiers committed to the island and only 13,000 evacuated. The rest died in combat, from disease, or from starvation, as American air and naval power interdicted their supply lines. For John George, Guadalcanal was a proving ground that validated everything he had believed about marksmanship and precision shooting. His Winchester Model 70 had performed exactly as he had expected, delivering accuracy at distances that made the difference between life and death. His approach to counter-sniper warfare had been vindicated in the most conclusive way possible, but his war was far from over. After recovering from his wound, George would go on to serve in one of the most legendary American units of World War II. His skills with a rifle would be tested again in terrain even more demanding than Guadalcanal. In late 1943, George was selected for a new unit being formed for special operations in the China-Burma-India Theater. This unit would become known as Merrill's Marauders, officially designated the 5,307th Composite Unit Provisional, one of the most famous American formations of the war. The Marauders were recruited from volunteers who were promised a dangerous and hazardous mission. The men came from units across the Pacific and the Caribbean, experienced soldiers who were willing to accept risk in exchange for action. George, with his combat record on Guadalcanal and his exceptional marksmanship skills, was exactly the type of soldier the Marauders needed. The unit trained in India under conditions designed to prepare them for long-range penetration operations behind Japanese lines in Burma. They learned jungle survival, communications, demolition, and the specialized tactics required for operating independently far from friendly support. The training was brutal, designed to weed out anyone who could not handle the physical and psychological demands of the mission ahead. In February 1944, the Marauders marched into Burma. 3 battalions divided into 6 combat teams with color-coded designations began a 1,000-mile journey over the Patkai mountain range and into the Burmese jungle behind Japanese lines. A total of 2,750 Marauders entered Burma. The remaining 247 men stayed in India as headquarters and support personnel. The mission was simple in concept and staggering in execution. The Marauders were to harass Japanese supply and communication lines, engage enemy patrols, assault rear areas, and create chaos behind the Japanese front lines. They would operate without the support of tanks, artillery, or air cover that American troops elsewhere took for granted. They would carry everything they needed on their backs, resupplied only by occasional airdrops to jungle clearings carved out by their own labor. The terrain was as hostile as any the Marauders had ever encountered. The Burmese jungle was dense, mountainous, and infested with disease. Malaria, dysentery, and typhus were constant companions. Leeches attached themselves to any exposed skin. Snakes lurked in the undergrowth. The monsoon rains transformed trails into rivers of mud that sucked at boots and made every step a struggle. And everywhere, the Japanese waited. The Marauders achieved remarkable results against often superior numbers. Near Wallabum, a town believed by American planners to be lightly held, the 3rd Battalion engaged and killed between 400 and 500 enemy soldiers in fierce fighting. The Marauders used mobility and surprise to compensate for their lack of heavy weapons. appearing where the Japanese did not expect them, striking hard, and withdrawing before the enemy could concentrate against them. George's skills as a marksman proved valuable throughout the campaign. When marauder units encountered Japanese positions, when enemy officers needed to be eliminated, when precision was required rather than volume of fire, soldiers like George made the difference. He was operating far from the structured environment of conventional warfare, but the fundamentals remained the same. See the target before it sees you. One shot, one kill. Move and survive. In April, the marauders were ordered to take up a blocking position at Enochpom-Gie and hold it against Japanese attacks. This was conventional defensive warfare for which the unit had not been equipped. The marauders were designed for hit-and-run operations, not for standing their ground against determined assaults. But orders were orders, and the marauders held. At times surrounded, the marauders coordinated their battalions in mutual support, fighting off Japanese attacks that came again and again. At Enochpom-Gie, the marauders killed 400 Japanese soldiers while suffering 57 killed in action, 302 wounded, and 379 incapacitated due to illness and exhaustion. The cost was devastating. By the time the unit reached Myitkyina, its final objective, only about 200 surviving members of the original marauders were still present. A week after Myitkyina fell, on August 10, 1944, the 5,307th was disbanded, with a final total of 130 combat-effective officers and men out of the original 2,997. Of the 2,750 who had marched into Burma, only 2 were left alive, who had never been hospitalized with wounds or major illness. None of the horses, and only 41 mules, survived the campaign. In slightly more than 5 months of combat, the marauders had advanced 750 miles through some of the harshest jungle terrain in the world, fought in 5 major engagements at Walaubum, Shaduzup, Inkangatong, and Pum-Ga, and Myitkyina, and engaged the Japanese army on 32 separate occasions. They had accomplished their mission at a cost that left the unit effectively destroyed. George survived the Burma campaign, one of the lucky ones who emerged from the jungle alive and relatively intact. His Winchester Model 70 had traveled with him from Illinois to Tennessee, to Guadalcanal, to India, to Burma. The rifle had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, probably more. George had stopped counting after Burma. The war in the Pacific continued for another year after the marauders were disbanded. George was reassigned, eventually reaching the rank of lieutenant colonel by the time he was demobilized in 1947. He had served 6 years in the Army, fighting in 2 theaters, proving repeatedly that his approach to warfare had merit. After the war, George returned to civilian life, but never forgot his experiences. He attended Princeton University on the GI Bill, completing his education after years of combat had delayed his academic career. He later worked for the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant, lecturer, and writer. Most importantly, George wrote about his experiences. His memoir, Shots Fired in Anger, A Rifleman's View of the War in the Pacific, was first published in 1947 and has remained in print ever since. The book is considered a classic of military literature, a detailed and honest account of what it was like to fight in the Pacific jungle with a rifle in your hands. George did not glorify combat. He wrote frankly about the confusion, the fear, the moments when training failed and instinct took over. He analyzed what worked and what did not work, criticizing American tactics, weapons, and leadership where he found them wanting. He also paid respect to his Japanese opponents, acknowledging their field craft and tactical skill, even while condemning their rigid adherence to doctrine that led to unnecessary casualties. The Winchester Model 70 that had caused such controversy sat in a footlocker in George's quarters at Fort Benning after the war. The rifle that his superiors had called a toy, a mail-order sweetheart, had proved itself in the hardest test imaginable. It had performed exactly as George had always known it would, delivering precision when precision was the difference between life and death. George's legacy extended beyond his personal achievements. His success at Point Cruz and his subsequent work training other soldiers influenced American military thinking about snipers and precision marksmanship. The Marine Corps had already recognized the value of scoped rifles, purchasing 373 Winchester Model 70 rifles in May 1942 for sniper use. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, Marine Scout snipers proved to be a force multiplier, their contributions going beyond traditional sniper roles. On Saipan, on Iwo Jima, on Okinawa, Marines with scoped rifles engaged Japanese officers at ranges of 800 to 1,000 yards, systematically destroying enemy command structures and creating chaos among units that suddenly found their leaders being eliminated from impossible distances. The lessons George learned on Guadalcanal, patience, precision, the superiority of a single well-aimed shot over volume of fire, were lessons that would be relearned and refined in every American conflict that followed. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, American snipers have continued to prove that one man with the right rifle, the right training, and the right mindset can influence a battlefield far beyond his individual firepower. Carlos Hathcock, the legendary Marine sniper of Vietnam with 93 confirmed kills, used a Winchester Model 70, the same type of rifle George had carried on Guadalcanal. Hathcock's exploits, crawling for days through enemy territory to eliminate high-value targets, pioneering techniques that are still taught to Marine snipers today, represented the continuation of a tradition that George helped establish. The story of John George and his mail-order rifle is ultimately a story about the power of individual initiative and expertise. In an army that valued standardization and doctrine, George trusted his own judgment and his own skills. He brought a weapon his superiors dismissed and proved through combat that he had been right all along. He refused to conform when conformity would have meant accepting inferior tools for the job he needed to do. 14 Americans died in the Point Cruz groves in 72 hours. Those deaths represented the cost of a problem that standard tactics could not solve. George solved it in 4 days with 11 shots. Each of those shots represented skill developed over years of practice, judgment honed by competition and training, and courage that allowed him to enter a killing ground where other men had died and emerge victorious. The Japanese snipers he eliminated were not evil men. They were soldiers doing their duty, using their skills in service of their country, just as George was using his skills in service of his. The difference was that George was better. He was better trained, better equipped, and better suited to the specific challenge of counter-sniper warfare. In the brutal calculus of combat, that difference meant he lived and they died. War is not fair. It does not reward good intentions or punish bad ones. It rewards effectiveness. George was effective because he understood his craft deeply, because he had prepared himself for challenges that others had not anticipated, and because he had the will to apply his skills when lives depended on it. The 132nd Infantry Regiment went on to serve throughout the Pacific War. After Guadalcanal, the regiment fought on Bougainville, where they engaged prepared enemy defenses and destroyed Japanese pillboxes using pole charges and bazookas. In 1945, the 132nd participated in the retaking of the Philippine Islands. On March 26th, preceded by heavy naval and aerial bombardment, troops waded ashore during an amphibious invasion of Cebu Island. Elements of the regiment later secured Mactan Island and Opon Airfield. In November 1945, the 132nd was inactivated at Fort Lewis, Washington. The men who served in the regiment, like John George, returned to their lives having seen and done things that would stay with them forever. Some wrote about their experiences. Most did not. But all of them carried the war within them, a part of who they were that could never be fully explained to those who had not been there. George lived long enough to see his book become a respected text among shooters and military historians. He lived long enough to see the principles he had applied on Guadalcanal become standard doctrine in American military training. He lived long enough to know that he had made a difference. The rifle still exists. The Winchester Model 70 that traveled from Illinois to the jungles of the Pacific and the mountains of Burma is a physical artifact of a remarkable journey. It represents the meeting point between individual skill and historical moment, between one man's preparation and the challenge that preparation was designed to meet. Thank you for watching this story of marksmanship, courage, and the Pacific War. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and share with others who appreciate military history. Leave a comment telling us what aspects of World War II you would like us to explore next. Until next time, remember the soldiers who carried their skills into the unknown and proved themselves equal to challenges that would have broken lesser men. The jungles of Guadalcanal have regrown. The bunkers have crumbled. The positions where Japanese snipers once waited have returned to forest. But the story of John George and his 11 shots remains, a testament to what one determined individual can accomplish when preparation meets opportunity. 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days. One rifle, one man who refused to accept the conventional wisdom that his weapon was inadequate. History is made by such people, by those who trust themselves when others doubt, by those who prepare for challenges that have not yet arrived, by those who understand that sometimes the unconventional approach is the only approach that will work. John George understood these things, and because he understood them, 14 more Americans did not die in the Point Cruz groves. His success was measured in lives saved as much as in enemies eliminated. That is the true measure of a soldier's worth, not the glory of his achievements, but the consequences of his actions for the men who served beside him. 2nd Lieutenant John George, 132nd Infantry Regiment, American Division. Illinois State Champion Marksman, Counter-Sniper Expert, Merrill's Marauder, author of one of the finest combat memoirs of the Second World War. His rifle was a toy until it was not. His methods were unconventional until they worked. His critics were silenced by results that could not be argued with. And his legacy lives on in every American sniper who understands that one shot, placed precisely where it needs to go, can change everything.